There are a lot of good wide receiver matchups here in week 11, but there are also some bad ones. So I'm here to help you try to avoid those landmines. Let's start it off with S and A tier. I'm kicking them off together because a lot of these players, they're already auto start. They're awesome. At worst, these guys are going to be wide receiver 2 on your team unless you're in a super small league. Again, these are tiers. So if you want to put Lad McConkey to the front of A tier or Nico Collins to the back of it, that's perfectly fine. They're interchangeable. The only wide receiver you might have concerns with is A.J. Brown. However, the Lions are second in points per game, and their defense is not as good as the Packers. We should see more fireworks than what we saw in Monday Night Football when the Eagles beat the Packers 10-7. But let's go ahead and talk about some receivers that you have more questions about on starting. So let's start it off with B tier, going with Zay Flowers versus the Cleveland Browns. He's been consistently okay, never having a great performance on the week until he catches a touchdown. Now, Devonta Smith versus the Detroit Lions. Again, much like A.J. Brown, I like Smith just as much. What may come to a surprise to many people is that Smith actually leads the Eagles in end zone targets. Jameson Williams on the other side of the ball versus the Eagles. He's grown to be more consistent over these past 2 games since the bye. And he's coming off his best game of the season. Stephon Diggs versus the New York Jets. Now, he's officially running hot with touchdowns. He's had 1 in each of the previous last 3 games. Kayshon Boutte was limited on Tuesday, and the Patriots play on Thursday Night Football. So Diggs may be without Boutte yet again. And then Quentin Johnston, since returning from his injury, he's been running the same number of routes as Ladd. Ladd is the main guy you want, but Johnston has been okay. Aronde Gadsden, for what it's worth, is probably going to miss Week 11 since the Chargers are 7-3. They have the Week 12 bye, and they're looking a little bit further ahead, probably looking at the playoffs at this point. That could be a spike in a workload that Johnston needs. Now in C tier, I do start it off with Jordan Addison. This right here is a nice matchup versus the Bears. It's encouraging that he got 11 targets just last week with J.J. McCarthy. The only bad news is he only caught 3 of them for 35 yards. Now Addison is a big play. He has big play potential written all over him. And the matchup is nice versus the Bears, who give up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. DK Metcalf versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Metcalf has been touchdown or bust most recently. He's been nothing but bust. And you might think that the Bengals matchup is nice. It is a 49.5 point over-under, so that's nice. It's one of the highest ones of the week. But he is also going against DJ Turner, who has been one of the best cornerbacks so far on the season. The kind of bright spot on the Bengals defense, shutting down number 1 wide receivers. And Tez Johnson versus Buffalo. Tez Johnson's running hot with touchdowns as well. Considering he's had 4 touchdowns with just 14 receptions over the past month, we should expect that to regress to the mean. It's a 48.5 point over-under, and Tez Johnson has every opportunity to make the most of it, considering he's playing a full allotment of snaps now. And Juwan Jennings versus Arizona. We still don't know if Ricky Pearsall or Brock Purdy will play this week, but if Pearsall doesn't suit up, you could play Jennings, who has been touchdown or bust, much like DK Metcalf. And Tedero McMillan. I'm not sure if we're allowed to say touchdown and Tedero McMillan in the same sentence. He's had 2 touchdowns all season, and they happen in the same game. The volume's there. The yardage is okay. It leaves a little bit more to be desired, but he's been not great because we really need those touchdowns. It's surprising that he's not getting them. But against the Falcons, who are 8th best against wide receivers, we might not see more touchdowns coming his way, at least this week. And then Deebo Samuel versus the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins are the 4th best against wide receivers. Deebo is the last man standing among reliable wide receivers for the Commanders. You got saved by a garbage time touchdown last week, so perhaps you avoid Deebo Samuel altogether. And then in D tier, perhaps we could just call this the teammate tier. You got the Broncos, Giants, Jags. They're holding down the fort. We got a lot of them in D tier. But Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin versus the Kansas City Chiefs. It is yet again another bad matchup. The Chiefs are the 6th hardest matchup for wide receivers. Franklin has been the wide receiver you've wanted over this past month. Since week 7, Franklin is the wide receiver 11, and Sutton has been the wide receiver 27. So if you want to rank Franklin ahead of Sutton, I'm perfectly fine with that. And Trey Tucker versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, Tucker has failed to get 38 yards or more in 3 consecutive games, and he hasn't had a touchdown since his 3 touchdown performance in week 3. The matchup is very nice. That's why he's so high in the rankings. Dallas allows the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, and it's really just Trey Tucker, Brock Bowers, and then kind of a hodgepodge of old man Tyler Lockett and a bunch of rookies. And then we go to the Giants wide receiver core. Now, it's kind of hard to evaluate this one. He played Green Bay. It's a hard matchup. It's not incredibly hard, but it's not good either. And now you got Jameis Winston as the quarterback. Now, that being said, I did bump the wide receivers up just a little bit with Jameis Winston news. In matchups last season where Winston played 95% of the snaps or more of the game, he threw the ball on average 45 times a game. He should be looked at as the great value version of Joe Flacco. He's going to be throwing it a ton, but he just doesn't have as talented wide receivers as Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Khalil Shakir versus the Bucs. I feel like we say it each and every single week, but he's kind of like Zay Flowers. You're okay without a touchdown, but you're really happy if he does get a touchdown. Ricky Pearsall, don't know if he plays. Last we saw that we were hopeful that he was going to practice this week. So if he plays, this is where he would be lined up. And then Brian Thomas Jr., Parker Washington. He's practicing on Wednesday. Now, if he does play, it's against the Chargers, who are the second hardest matchup for wide receivers. Now, I do think Parker Washington is still a decent flex if Brian Thomas Jr. does suit up. All right, let's go over to E tier. Starting it off with Jerry Jeudy versus the Baltimore Ravens. Now, he had 12 targets last week after the bye, but perhaps more intriguing was Kevin Stefanski, head coach of the Browns, took over play calling duties from the OC. It's a matchup that suggests a lot of passing as they're 7.5-point underdogs versus the Ravens. Now, Michael Wilson, we just got news. Marvin Harrison Jr. got ruled out on Wednesday with appendicitis. He's going to have that procedure. Personally, I've had it. It hobbled me for about 3 to 4 weeks, but I'm not a superhuman. I like Marvin Harrison Jr. NFL players we've seen come back as early as a week, maybe 2 weeks. In the meantime, Michael Wilson does benefit from that to play against San Francisco 49ers. He's only ran 6 less routes than Marvin Harrison Jr. this season. It's not a smash play, but he should see an uptick of volume. And Jacoby Myers versus the Jags, I feel like he would be the one who's impacted the most if Brian Thomas Jr. does suit up. Again, it is not a great matchup versus the Chargers. And then Christian Watson versus the Giants. There's still no additional news on Romeo Doubs just this moment. He did sustain a chest injury on Monday Night Football, so if Doubs does happen to miss, that could help out Christian Watson, who is already getting deep targets, but not a lot of targets overall in general. And Keenan Allen versus the Jags, he's had one great game with 4 duds over the past 5 games. He's been the odd man out for the Chargers, unfortunately. And DJ Moore versus the Vikings. I said when he had back-to-back 70-yard games that he was heating up, and then he comes out and gives us a goose egg in Week 10. Now, he did get banged up with a shoulder injury, so that will be something to monitor. And then Xavier Worthy versus the Broncos. He's taken the biggest hit since Rashee Rice has come back into the lineup, and it doesn't help that they're playing Denver, who are number 1 against wide receivers. Now in F tier, I've got just a few more names for you because there are players that are playing in deeper leagues, so good luck if you are starting any of them. Again, I understand it, but if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube. I do go live each and every single day, so turn on notifications so you can come through on one of the lives. Maybe you want to talk about some players that we had listed here today. If you want to check out my rankings or my rest of season rankings, you can find them in the link in my bio.